Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Kelly Welsh, Director of Business Development and Outreach at the Naval Institute and retired Surface Navy officer. Welcome to the West Theater panel session, Are Smart Unmanned Maritime Vehicles the Path to a 500-Ship U.S. Navy? I have the pleasure of introducing the moderator of the panel, Captain George Galdarisi. You can read his full bio in the app. I'll just hit a few highlights for you this morning. Captain George Galdarisi is a career naval aviator in the HSL community and an award-winning best-selling author who began his writing career in 1978 with an article in the U.S. Naval Institute's Proceedings. He is the Director of Strategic Assessments and Technical Futures at the Naval Information Warfare Center Pacific. He's published several books, but perhaps the ones that we're most proud of are the ones that he's published through the Naval Institute. In particular, The Kissing Sailor, which proved the identity of the two principals in Alfred Eisenstadt's famous photograph, as well as AI at War, and there will be a book signing this afternoon at the Naval Institute booth at 3:30. He's received a number of national and international writing awards, and we are privileged to have him moderate this panel for us this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Captain George Galdarisi.
So, Kelly, thanks for that very kind introduction. At Nightwing Pacific, when our commanding officer introduces me before I give the technical vision brief, he says, now you're going to hear from a knuckle-dragging naval aviator on a closely supervised work release program. So, Kelly, this is a big step, so thanks for that. Kelly told you who I am. First of all, on behalf of the panel, I'd like to thank the Naval Institute and NAVSEA for giving us a chance to share our views. We all feel pretty passionately about this subject, so getting to talk with you all is a real privilege for us. So what are we going to talk about for the next hour? First of all, the theme of the conference, as you know, is readiness, capability, and capacity. How do the sea services match up against the threat? This panel specifically, again, the details are in your app, but it's basically involves, the Chief of Naval Operations has said we're going to have a 500-ship Navy, which is 375 crewed vessels and about 150 unmanned vessels. And how we get there with crewed vessels is pretty straightforward. We know the ships the fleet has now, we know the ships the fleet is building, but what those 150 unmanned vessels are going to be and what they're going to do, that's pretty opaque. But we're going to try to shed some light on that, particularly what AI and machine learning can do, to borrow an aviation term, to make these unmanned vessels smart wingmen. So we've assembled a panel for you of subject matter experts. You have their bios in your West app, but from my left is Commander Jerry Daly, Commanding Officer of Unmanned Surface Vessel Division 1, Mr. Bruce Hansen, CEO of Martac Incorporated. It's a U.S.-based manufacturer who's had unmanned surface vehicles in a large number of U.S. Navy and Marine Corps exercise experiments and demonstrations. Dr. Jamie Lukos, who I work with at our lab, who's the Business Portfolio Manager for Battle Space Awareness at the Naval Information Warfare Center Pacific, and Dr. Sam Tangratti, the Leidos Chair of Future Warfare Studies at the U.S. Naval War College and the lead editor of the book AI at War that Kelly was kind enough to mention. So we have a ConOps. Each of our panelists will speak for just a few minutes to let you know who they are and what their organization does in this area. And then I'll ask each panelist one additional question focused specifically on what their organization does. So let's get right to it. To get warmed up, I've asked each panelist to address this question. From your perspective, what are the challenges and opportunities of having a U.S. Navy populated with large number of unmanned vessels? So Commander Daly, would you kick it on off, please?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. My name is Jerry Daly. I'm the Commanding Officer of Unmanned Surface Vessel Division 1, and our primary job is to be the bridge between the NAVSEA technical communities and the fleet in preparation to transition large and medium unmanned surface vessels to program of record. We are in the process of developing tactics, techniques, procedures, ConOps, concepts of employment, and using enabling capabilities to define what exactly the capabilities of M and L will have as they transition, And by having sailors involved in that process earlier rather than later and getting direct fleet feedback from the operational commander, we're hedging down risk in those transitions for those programs of record. And that's where my team of fleet sailors is directly engaged, managing the hulls of MD USV, Sea Hunter and Seahawk, and then the OUSVs, which transitioned from the Secretary of Defense Strategic Capabilities Office, Ghost Fleet Overlord Program. So that's what I do every day. And how are we going to get to a 150 ship unmanned fleet? We're going to continue to find the right ways to integrate with the fleet today and normalize those operations and find the right blend between technology, fleet engagement, and how the C4I networks and autonomy evolve with technology over time and have that merge correctly at the right time as the fleet is built out with those programs of record. And that's where I sit today. But where we're moving in the future, smaller form factors like what Bruce works through every day and how they directly integrate with medium and large is a larger problem set that we're tackling with the operational commander today as well. And
Okay.
I'm happy to be here.
Thank you, sir. Next up is Mr. Bruce Hansen, and a fun fact about Bruce is that USVs are in his DNA. His dad built an autonomous USV in 1965, and Bruce said if anyone's interested in that history, he still has the original documents and the 3-foot-long wooden Chris craft, and the mission that USV performed back then was based on punch cards. So turn it over to Bruce.
Okay. Hello? Oh. Hi, I'm Bruce Hansen. I'm CEO and run Maritime Tactical Systems. Everybody knows as MARTAC. We're an industry partner, and the way we view things on this 500 ship fleet is obviously the unmanned side. And the whole point about this is that we're not out to replace anything. What we're out there for is to augment and enhance what is out there and lower the human loading, because human loading is what we're trying to lower. So once again, if you didn't hear it, augment and enhance what's out there today. So one of our biggest things is quantities. I mean, you're trying to get quantity into this thing at a reasonable cost to the military. And so that way you can cover much larger areas. You don't have the fatigue and other items that you have with humans. And also, you can be out there persistent for very, very long periods of time. So that's one of the things that we're looking at. But it comes down to, how do we support the war fighters? How do we support the U.S. Navy, the big fleets? And how do we expand, the control and or covering large areas all around the world at once, because you only have so many humans to work with. So we're trying to make it such that you cover much larger areas. With things that we call them fighter jets on the water, it's not only they can do that, they can do some other items, but they can do things like, people do over a period of time, the guard in the shack, so you have ISR, so you can have, once again, visibility all over the place without having lots and lots of human interaction. So I'll leave it at that right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. Next up is Dr. Jamie Lukos. A fun fact about Jamie is that to make a few bucks during grad school at Arizona State University, she was a beer vendor at many Phoenix sporting events, and she actually found that running up and down stairs yelling "beer here" was refreshing and a great stress reliever during grad school. So I'll turn it over to Jamie.
Thanks, George. Hi, everybody. Yeah, my name is Jamie Lucas. I am the Battle Space Awareness Business Portfolio Manager at the Naval Information Warfare Center Pacific, so right down the street in Point Loma. So what that title means is basically we have 1,000 or so different projects at Nightwing Pacific, and we try to split them up into different portfolios so that we can track different areas of interest, both within our organization and outside in terms of the Navy needs. So battle space awareness is within the ISR department, so it's very ISR heavy in terms of what's within that portfolio. And unmanned systems is definitely one of the primary interests that we have at Nightwing Pacific. So for example, Commander Daly's Sea Hunter and Seahawk sit at our piers, and our people are helping to do the test and evaluation and basically preparing it for operations. So yeah, I went to grad school too. So my background's actually in neuroscience. So a scientist by training, and so I kind of got into this field by looking at initially trust. So trust in interpersonal trust, and that kind of morphed into trust in AI, and that kind of got into human-machine teaming. So I'm really interested in how the human element is performing with the unmanned system and how we can improve that so that we have a holistic and hybrid Navy of the future.
Thank you, Jamie. So finally is Dr. Sam Tangratti. Sam is a writer, and a fun fact about him in the realm of writing is that he was once written in as a character in an adventure novel, but the author killed him off in the second chapter, so there's probably a cautionary tale there. So Sam, over to you.
Thank you, George. Before I begin, those people who work for other companies, don't get scared that it says Leidos Chair of Future Warfare Studies. Leidos was so kind as to give a grant to the Naval War College Foundation, the research funds which I can utilize. So I'm not representing them, and I work with everybody else, but I benefited from their generosity. The other thing that I'm speaking today just for myself, not for U.S. Naval War College or any part of U.S. Navy. I am a strategist who looks at technology. I'm not a technologist, but my approach is to ask the questions beyond the technology on how these systems can be integrated into the Navy and integrated Navy strategy. So I'm the one who asks the questions of, how much is this going to cost? How long will it take? What are the vulnerabilities it brings? What do we have to give up to be able to use this capability? How does it integrate our strategy? And then what are the alternatives? And because the budget, obviously defense budget is finite, we have to decide where we're going to put the investment. And although we would love to invest in every unmanned system you could possibly think of, we cannot do that. Another thing I wanted to say, kind of to burst the bubble of the title of this panel, is what Commander Daly does is very, very important, and what Mr. Hansen provides very, very important. Dr. Lucas is doing great work, but this isn't building towards a 500-ship Navy. These vessels are not ships. The number is a political controversy and things. These are systems that will augment the capabilities that we have, but they are not, at the point that we are not building warships that can perform in multiple domains. I mean, you think about DDG, particularly if it has ABM capabilities, it fights in the exoatmosphere, conducts air warfare, conducts surface warfare, conducts undersea warfare. We are not, industry, technology, we're not at that level because it'll take millions of lines of code and it'll be a engineering challenge. But what we can do is we can give capabilities in those gaps that the Navy, that the Navy needs systems to perform the mission. I think of something like Sea Hunter, on talking unclassified, designed to do C4ISR, perhaps deception, trail submarines, but it's not going to fight air warfare. To do that requires a whole, it requires beyond the amount of money that we're spending on it, requires beyond what we're going to do. But they fill a role that is essential. Now, when I talk about this, people say, well, what about an uncrewed arsenal ship? It is possible, but if it's built, it will be as a slave to other ships. It will be what the MITRE, which is a federally funded think tank, calls a magazine ship. Some other ship will control the missiles, because that's where the technology is. To do a autonomous ship like that in warfare areas, we're not at that point, and also, quite frankly, political leadership is not at that point to be able to use that. But one of the areas that my research is the question of this. are we going to be, is the Navy going to be driven to autonomy in the future? What I mean by that is, in a high-end warfight, where the People's Republic of China, Chinese Communist Party, is a technological near peer, will some of those uncrewed systems that we are controlling from terrestrial positions, you think of Predator, you think of Reaper, even Triton, will the electromagnetic warfare be so intense that we will not be able to control them, so that they have to be autonomous in order to function? Otherwise, they go dead in the water. So that's one of the issues that I work on, and that's a big issue, both on the strategy and policy side, and then on the technology side.
Okay, thank you, Sam. So I have one more question for each panelist, and it's designed specifically for them and their organization to tease out a little bit more about what they do in this field. So for Commander Daly, given what's written in the Navy's Unmanned Campaign Framework, can you tell us a little bit more about the Navy's Unmanned Task Force and what your role in that is, and then what your unmanned vessels have done in RIMPAC?
Thank you. So I am part of the Unmanned Task Force that Michael Stewart leads back at the Pentagon. His team has a much broader problem set than just unmanned surface vessels. I'm one piece of his puzzle of tackling, as other members have discussed, the problems that the Navy faces today, and whether it's gaps or additional capability that's required, and we are a contributing member into that organization. They cover all of the domains: air, subsurface, and surface. I'm primarily in the surface vessel business at Unmanned Surface Vessel Division 1. And then as far as transitioning into, what we are doing to get after that problem set with my particular portfolio, I'd love to talk about all of the things that we do, but we are a little bit different from some of the COCO models that Task Force 59 is doing out in the Middle East. We are working directly with government research organizations and at higher classification levels, but I would love to tell you. But what I can tell you is we are working on closing kill chains, long-range fires, and all of the things associated with giving information, time, and battle space back to the decision maker on a manned platform. And that's sort of agnostic to M and L, right? We're walking and chewing gum at the same time for the development of the capabilities of medium and large USV. Large USV, first program of record through the gate with OpNav N96, magazine ship, as some call it, right? VLS-capable platform. But the technology development that PMS 406 and PEO USC are doing are agnostic to the platform and more about capability development and integrating both integrated combat system and all of the other sensors and payloads that will integrate into that system in order to buy down that decision space, because at the end of the day, in a comms denied environment, it's going to become more and more difficult to communicate. And how we communicate and working through those tactics today will buy us time in a future conflict. And as far as AI and ML are concerned, there's a very big difference between an autonomous ship that's, I would say, on the loop for control versus an unmanned aerial system that is very much fly-by-stick. And that distinction is different. That doesn't necessarily mean there is a ton of machine learning associated with autonomy, but some of the payloads and systems and technology associated with sensors could very much incorporate AI and ML, again, to buy down the decision space and give the operational commander or the controlling unit on a destroyer the ability to make decisions faster than our adversary.
Okay, thank you, sir. So for Mr. Hansen, going back to when you first had your Mantis and Devil Ray boats in the Navy and Marine Corps exercises, experiments, and demonstrations up through last year, what were the primary missions that the Navy was interested in you performing, and then what do you think the missions for USVs are going to be in the future?
Sure. So along those lines, we've been doing experiments and demonstrations exercises with our navies and Five Eyes and other countries since about 2014. The whole reason for that, obviously, is to find out what the end user wants. All these capability gaps, things like that. So what we found over the years is that ISR is always one of the biggest ones. Eyes on, persistence, not having people in harm's way, that whole thing. How can we get that SA back to the decision makers as fast as possible? So it's ISR above and below water. Logistics is another big one, ship to shore, ship to ship, things like that. Expeditionary, that's another big mission set that we hear about all the time. MCM comes in and out quite often. Port and harbor security is another one, and it's not just port and harbor security, it's ships at rest, ships while they're entering, high value escorting, things like that. Stuff that is very labor intensive a lot of the time. We have to take crews out, and have to have all these people out there that it's not always nice out there. You know the way it is. Environment can be nasty. Open ocean and or coming into ports, it's not always nice and pretty. It's rainy, it's nasty, it's windy. They don't want to be out there, they're fatigued. These can do that, so take the load off of them. So that's a lot of the stuff. Along those lines also is that one of the things that we deal with, you hear about all the time with the AI side, is the trust and autonomy. Everybody goes, hey, we want to trust in your autonomy, but we're not there yet. So how do these mission profiles fit, and what level of autonomy do you need to do each one of those missions? ISR mission, usually not that bad, but when you start getting more and more in non-lethal stuff or even lethal or kinetics, then it's a whole different ballgame. You definitely want people in the loop, on the loop, things like that. So that becomes very important. And then to piggyback a little bit on what Commander Daly said, is we've been intimately involved with Unmanned Task Force. We've been right in the center of TF-59, and if you listen to what's going on with CNO and SecNav, they want to replicate that for the different fleets. So things like, we're working right now with 6th Fleet, and then at a future time, I'm sure it's going to be 3rd Fleet, 7th Fleet, 4th Fleet, all that stuff. So that's kind of where we see things in the future a little bit. Last year, we did things with IMX with multiple countries. Autonomous Warrior. This is over in the Middle East 5th Fleet AOR. We just got done with a thing called Digital Horizon. And we've done a whole bunch of other mission profiles on top of that. So we've done a lot of things with Special Forces, medical, medvac stuff, ingress, egress. So as you can see, the profile of Unmanned can really expand. And it really comes down to, once again, replication, quantities, how you can really get out there and really augment and support the end user, the warfighters, operators, and ultimately the large Navy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bruce. So for Dr. Lukos, given the Navy's desire to have unmanned systems and specifically unmanned maritime systems operate in a semi-autonomous, supervised autonomous, or fully autonomous mode, what are the challenges and opportunities of writing the code to make that happen?
Yeah, so actually both Commander Daly and Bruce touched on that there's different modes. There's human in the loop, on the loop, very dependent on the mission, very dependent on the platform that you have, very dependent on the people and their capability as well. So it does vary a lot, but I think at the core of it all is trust, right? It really is transparency within the software that will help both the end user, the developer, the tester, everyone to really understand what the model is doing. Because if we are talking about AI and we're talking about ML, which may change over time, it really is important that we know where that's going. So that really to me is most vital, and that's really requiring a change in the way we buy software and the way we manage software and our interactions with industry. I assume those in the audience that are from industry kind of see it too. There's a lot more open source software now because people want to see what's underneath the hood, and it's really important. And then there's also this need, and I talked about different users. So it's like you need different interfaces for different personas. So you need to make it simple enough where a warfighter in crisis can understand exactly what's happening, understand exactly what buttons to press, and really be able to utilize the system to ensure decisions are made quicker, ensure that kill chain is as efficient as possible. But then you also need interfaces for the testers to look under the hood, see what happened, be able to really kind of customize it as necessary depending on what mission is coming up. So oftentimes it's just sort of like a software is handed over and then it's a black box, and that's not going to work really in today's fight, because it's ever changing, it's dynamic, it's mission dependent, and those missions change over time. So enabling our warfighters to change things on the fly is going to be really, really important. Also, the heart of it, the hard part really in the software development is this shared understanding of the world, right? How do we make sure that our warfighters and our autonomous systems are thinking the same thing, are feeling the same thing, have the same amount of information? So communication between humans and between autonomous systems is going to be critical. So again, my background is more on the human side, so using a human as a sensor and sensing a human in that environment, how can we then take that information and give it back to the autonomous system so that it knows the operator? But of course, it goes both ways. So that's going to be a critical component that's really, it's difficult to program. How can you really, know what an AI is thinking, so to speak? But again, that takes a transparency, making sure the right information is ingested, understanding that it has environmental data, it has mission data, it has commander's intent, it has, who you are as all part of this holistic human-machine team. I think that really is one of the keys to the future. And the last part, I'd say, is modularity. So hardware is advancing very, very quickly. The autonomous systems we used 2 years ago are different than today. They're different than, they're different 6 months ago. It's just ever changing, and our technology, as you know, is just rapidly evolving. So having, to as much of an extent as possible, making software agnostic to the platform is really, really helpful. Of course, it can be, it has to, at some point, be able to work on, a UAV versus a UUV, and there's differences there, and that's known. But being able to have some common ground where there is that modularity, especially as we move towards more joint coalition fighting, is going to be super important. Yeah, I think those are the main points.
Thanks, Jamie.
Thanks.
Then finally, for Dr. Tangratti, assuming that the momentum that Commander Daly and Mr. Hansen have talked about with unmanned surface vehicles participating in a number of exercises, and assuming that people like Dr. Lukos and her colleagues can write the code to give that sufficient AI and machine learning, briefly, what are the tactical, operational, and even strategic possibilities that these vessels will present to the Navy in the future?
Well, I want to explain why I talk about the systems that we're building as extensions of capability and as gap fillers, because that takes away the political aspects of the issue of autonomy. The Navy has been using autonomous systems for over 40 years, because when you look at something like close-in weapon systems, put in the full auto mode, that's an autonomous system that is, you could say, small AI, because if you define AI as replicating human decision-making, then it detects, tracks, gets a fire control solution, and shoots in that particular mode. And decision makers have not been so afraid of that. Yes, it has possibility of accidents, and that might happen, but that is not something that there's great fear over the Navy or other services having. But when you start talking about vessels, aircraft, suddenly brings in this idea that somehow this is so different than what we did before. And my message is, this is not so different than what we did before. This is an extension of capabilities. I don't want to slip just into talking about AI, but I want to talk about some challenges that you folks in industry that I think you need to think about. AI works best in a rules-based situation where there's complete information. You're talking about processing big data. Well, AI system might be the Go master in the game of Go, but the rules of that game do not change while they're playing the game. That's not war. So the challenge for those companies that are working on the AI ML problem is, how do you design systems that are going to adjust when, quote, the rules change? How do you design systems that can operate with partial information? And the one fear I have about this, and it affects the autonomous vessels, is deception. When I go and talk to the folks, say, Silicon Valley, the straight AI builders, and I say, You know, for us, deception is an issue. Sun Tzu says, you know, all war is deception. You know, what can we do with these systems to prevent that? And they told me, well, you can't have deception. All you need is more data. If you have big data, we could determine there's anomalies in the patterns, and so we won't be deceived. I said, well, what if you can't get that data, or the opponent is trying to, you know, poison that data, or spoof that data, or give you false data? What do you do? And that's something that some companies I discuss with who don't do defense kind of issues kind of throw up their hands. So if I were a defense company and want to work in AI, ML, I would think about this issue of how does the system handle deception? That's one of my big concerns. Now, I know IARPA, which is the intelligence community's version of DARPA, is starting to wrestle with that. They call it adversarial AI. So that's one area that I think needs to. The other thing about autonomous systems is partial autonomy might be a solution that we could work with, because in the AI situation, we find that human-machine teaming is what we might be the best beneficial way to approach some of these problems, just like Dr. Lucas was saying, because it's the human that has the creativity and control. I think about something like Arsenal ship. When Vice Admiral Metcalf first suggested that, he said, you know, I want a propulsion plant, I want 200 or so vertical launchers, and I want 3 sailors and an anchor windlass. And that the emphasis is that that system could be operated in a relatively using a small crew, because it had, you know, one primary mission, and it would be connected as an extension of the other ships, of the other shooters. Now, can we replace those 3 sailors with AI? Maybe, but we definitely will need AI to power some of those functions on the ships that sailors cannot do. One limit, I think, of autonomous vessels, of integrating into the fleet, is another aspect that the companies need to think about, and that's how do you do the repairs in a combat situation? The autonomous vessels will not be able to repair themselves. In any manned, crewed vessel, you know, you have damage control specialists, you have a whole bunch of people capable of conducting repairs. How are we going to be able to operate the autonomous systems under those circumstances? Because to design a system that can repair itself is going to cost a tremendous amount of money, and it's going to require this is a big engineering challenge, as you all know. So anyway, I will end my comments by just saying, for industry, if you're interested in the AI ML, an area that needs to be worked that others aren't working in is how do you handle deception? Now, there's various classification levels of that, and maybe there's a black program somewhere that I don't know about that's going to solve all the problems. I kind of doubt that. But the other thing to think about is when you think about autonomy is there's difference between pure autonomy and autonomy on various levels, and integrating that with human-machine teaming. To get pure autonomy is a challenge, because you think about, can these systems operate under combat conditions? Can they dodge the enemy missile? That is a challenge to build a system. But the systems we are building can fit the strategy as far as giving us the capabilities that extends our capability. Again, various systems, I was just reading about Sea Hunter, so it's stuck in my mind, but a trail system, a system that could trail submarines in a peacetime environment, that gives us the information that if war would occur, locations and that, maybe someday we could put a torpedo on it, that will extend our capabilities. It does not replace an ASW ship that can do a whole variety of things, but it extends our capabilities. So that's what I think how we should look at autonomy, because it takes away the political and policy issues if we view it that way, instead of, you know, killer drones or whatever a lot of critics have.
Okay, thank you, Sam. Okay, so now that you've heard from our panelists, we wanted to open the floor to you. So please step up to the mic in the front of the room, identify yourself and your organization, and ask whatever question you have. You can address your question to one panelist or to the panel in general. In that case, we'll figure out who can best answer it, or whoever volunteers. And as a courtesy to others, just ask a one-part question if you don't mind, and I'm sure our panelists would prefer responding to questions than listening to a manifesto. So who's first up to the mic?
Hey, good morning. Brian Heatherman, Viasat. So as a retired Marine infantry officer, one of the most dangerous things we did in combat is go in and out of friendly lines. Also, you know, when we start talking about like large war plans, also when we're doing passage of lines with units, incredibly dangerous. Got to make sure we know everything on the battlefield. So in the autonomous world, because the enemy is starting to develop things of their own, have you begun experimenting with identify friend or foe technology so that you know that, because I think that there's some application there with contested logistics. You know, you got to know what's coming towards you.
Who wants to start?
Go ahead.
You go ahead.
Great question. I think the first thing that we need to assess is what form factor can execute obtaining that battle space awareness that you're describing based on the particular battle space, right? And I think that there's probably more than one answer to that question based on the battle space, or it's a combination of smaller form factors like Bruce's vessels and an MUSV to sense that environment or sanitize the environment, being able to identify friend or foe. Some of that teaming between manned and unmanned is happening now within my portfolio. And then Bruce has sort of the other half of that portfolio on the smaller side amongst other industry partners. We are tackling that exact problem now, and how that medium ship would team up with a fully manned destroyer or crewed as ship to allow that decision space to be as, like we described, as tight as possible without having friendly fire.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Anyone else want to pile on for that question?
Yeah, that just leads me to another thought about the need to go towards autonomy. Is that's what our opponents are doing, and that's what they are going to do, and that's one of the things we face. When Russia has, I think, has a lead in ground, actually using ground semi-autonomous systems in combat. They tried to use it in Syria. Didn't work all that well, but they're working on that. Now, you have to think about the human in the loop issue, because a nation that is willing to recruit hardened criminals out of their prisons to fight aren't going to worry about how much, aren't going to worry about giving the authority to the autonomous systems to actually conduct combat operations. And so the question is, does that push us more towards that to be able to actually engage them in what I think is you'd call a technological near-peer war? That's one of the things that we can consider, and China, quite frankly, is gonna, if we don't do something different, China will be the dominant AI player in the globe. Why? Because they're going to pour a lot of money into it, because that's the tool the Chinese Communist Party will use to retain control. So their incentives are so different. They can force the companies to give them the code, since they're not really independent companies. They've got the incentive to do that. So what you folks have to do is figure out how to get ahead of that, even though the incentives for the U.S. government is not the same. That's going to be a big challenge.
All right, thank you, Sam. Yes, sir. Who's next?
How you doing? Ed Leopold, Persistent Systems. We make mobile ad hoc networks. Just curious, we're working with Nightwing and warfare centers currently with unmanned systems using mobile ad hoc networks for real-time situational awareness, getting sensor data real-time to ship to shore. But I believe there's a gap in the big Navy in terms of understanding the capability of that network. I just want to know what's the roadmap to include mobile ad hoc networks in the discussion for unmanned system talking to ships, to shore, to expeditionary warfare, expeditionary strike groups, et cetera.
Jamie, do you want to start it off with addressing that question?
Well, I think Commander Daly should. I don't know the big
Actually-
Navy answer, or maybe Bruce.
So it's not as much in the future, but in this past year at both IMX and Autonomous Warrior, we did that exact thing. So we were bridging between SATCOMs and mesh networks and self-healing networks, and it was very successful. But the one thing you run into is every exercise is a comms exercise. Everybody knows that. So when you start trying to do comms denied, that's always the tricky thing. So on the unmanned AI side, persistent system, we've used your stuff on our vessels before. We've set our vessels up such that they can be completely no communications whatsoever, truly autonomous and run that kind of stuff. Now, that's not the future of the networks, but we have already bridged between the SATCOMs and equivalent 4Gs, line of sight, beyond line of sight, mesh networks, all that, to a point that we were feeding back all of our sensors, let's say ISR sensors, 7 cameras at once we were doing, and the same time being controlled completely differently, like say a aerial vehicle off our stuff, and all this stuff was being piped back to not only Command Center and 5th Fleet, it actually was real time going all the way back to the Pentagon live. So that kind of stuff is happening. I can't tell you lots of nitty gritty how it happened because I don't talk about that here, but it's actually happening. But the future stuff, I'm sure Jerry probably could give you some more info.
So it's a valid point about the transition between ground forces and naval forces. We are fully in lockstep with the Marine Corps, Marine Littoral Regiments, and how we as a joint force are going to fight, particularly with a larger AOR such as the Pacific, if that were to come to conflict. But there is not one solution, I would argue. I think it's a multitude of solutions. I think a portion of them probably need to tie directly into traditional Navy networks, right? And then others, in smaller form factors, probably don't need to be directly tied to them. And frankly, I wouldn't want them directly tied. They'd be more local to enact the same type of fires that the Marine Corps or Army, Air Force in the joint fires fight would probably want. But we are working through that with Nightwing Pacific and other warfare centers to find the right seams to where we can tie in emerging technology into traditional joint systems.
Great.
And the last thing,
Thank you.
last thing about that, I think you saw that last year with Ukraine when they had all their problems. They ended up going to Starlink, so they made their own Ad Hoc network.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Yes, sir.
Good morning. I'm Lieutenant Commander Brian Kern. I'm a PhD candidate at the Naval Postgraduate School. And so my question, just to kind of set the frame here, the Air Force has been working a lot, I'm sure you've heard of the XQ-58 Valkyrie, the idea that this is an attritable system that you can basically have as a loyal wingman to some fighter that they're developing, et cetera, et cetera. So I was wondering if maybe you might be able to speak to, and I suppose maybe Commander, you might have a bit of insight into this. We're talking about the hybrid fleet model, the idea that essentially you'd have destroyers working alongside these unmanned systems to some capacity. I was wondering maybe how might you envision this working? Would this be some future iteration of the Sea Hunter or some other system? Just was wondering if we could maybe give a bit of an idea as to how this hybrid fleet model would work.
Sure. I didn't directly address the RIMPAC discussion, but I think this is a good point to bring up. At the unclassified level, I explained it to our partner nations that we work with at RIMPAC. My team worked directly for a Korean 2-star and a Japanese 2-star as part of the exercise at RIMPAC. And this is the explanation that I gave them. Extensions of your combat system, as we've talked about on this panel, and providing sensor data back to the manned platform. It's no different than a P-8 or an EP-3 that takes off from an airbase somewhere far away. It checks out with its home guard and shifts control to an afloat unit. The afloat unit uses the sensors, the weapon systems, and they're directly tied in through traditional Navy networks in order to enact fires, right? So if you use that concept, something that we already know, and the Navy has tried and true on working through those concepts, you apply that into DMO, distributed maritime operations, and you find that right way to blend the two to get the hybrid fleet, right? But more, it's just an extension of the systems on board a manned platform, mostly in the sensing world, right? But then in the LUSV concept, it is actual fires through BLS module.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, if it's okay, I'll pile on to your question. So it's been widely broadcast that the Chief of Naval Operations said that in 2027, we're going to have unmanned systems, unmanned surface systems operating with a Navy carrier strike group. And to go back to Sam Tangratti's point of these unmanned systems can't do their own maintenance, et cetera, et cetera. So when you operate that large USV carrying medium and small USVs with a strike group, then sailors can go over to that ship if something's wrong, if a fuel pump malfunctions, then they can actually do the repairs. And that's important because years ago people were talking about the Ghost Fleet, which was a fleet of totally unmanned systems going out and doing the work of the Republic. So I don't know, and most of us don't know how that could ever work. So this is, I think, a big step forward. Thanks again for your question.
Yeah, and I would also add, actually, we work pretty regularly with the Air Force Research Lab, and so we have awareness of the Loyal Wingman program. And so what we're trying to do as like a cross-service initiative is, yeah, take what they're learning, which is different. A pilot and his cockpit is just very different than, you know, a sailor and an unmanned system. There's just a lot more space, a lot of time. Like, there's a lot of components that are different, but they are doing a lot of great work in that area, and we're trying to leverage that and figure out how their lessons learned could be applied to the future naval fleet. So, yeah.
Thanks, Jamie.
Can I add one thing about talking about the repair and maintenance? The Navy had past knowledge of that when we built destroyer tenders, and we still have subtenders. Eventually, we will hopefully design the tenders that could support Commander Daly's systems forward. That's one of the issues that we have to think about how to do that. Now, if I were Chief of Naval Operations, I probably would want to retain some of those LSDs that we're going to decommission because they got a well deck. I don't know if they've experimented with a system, so you can put the systems on. And move them to the theater. That's one of the things that I'm concerned about unmanned systems being. There's some sort of expectation that somehow we're going to sail them from here to there. No, we're going to have to build a whole infrastructure, a network, in the sense that we're going to have to be able to bring them on board some sort of vessel and get them there. That's going to be a challenge that we haven't started thinking about because we're not quite at the point. But it is going to be one of those challenges. Operating autonomous systems will not just be about operating autonomous systems. There's much more involved.
Thanks, Sam. So my Abraham Lincoln Strike Group shipmate, Craig Mansing.
Hello, former commanding officer, now working at Naval. For Mr. Hansen, Commander Daly, a question: for Mr. Hansen, how do you deal with liability if you cause a collision at sea, or sink a fishing boat, or shoot down an airliner from an autonomous system? And similarly, for Commander Daly, how do you deal with command accountability? Who gets relieved for cause? How does that work?
So from our side of things, that was one of the trickiest things. We have a person that's working for us now, and the whole deal is they came from the insurance industry. And I said, if you can figure out how to get us unmanned insurance, I'll hire you. And she did. So it took her about 18 months. We got unmanned vessel insurance worldwide. It's underwritten by Lloyd's of London. But the trick with the whole thing is if you're a COCO model, we're on the hook. But what happened at IMX is the minute the boat touches the water with anything that would be considered lethal or putting it in harm's way, we have to sign a bailment to the military. So at that point, they have ownership of the vessel until it comes back to the ship and gets popped back up. So that was one thing. And that's a really tricky one. So we actually, the COCO model is nice, but liabilities are tricky. So we actually were dealing with, let's say, a GCC country, like, oh yeah, can we COCO model yours? We're like, oh, no way. There's a foreign military running, so you can do a GOCO model or an outright purchase. So I don't know if that answers part of your question, but it is a tricky one. The liabilities, the minute you go kinetic, we have to be out of it. There's no way we can be involved, and that's where the military comes in. I'm sure Jerry's got some answers for that one.
So I won't joke, but it sounds like something a JAG should answer instead of me for the relief for cause question. But what I will tell you is I have GOCO vessels for research, development, test, and evaluate now, right? So I think that's a future conversation where ships commanding officers that are in direct control of an unmanned vessel, there needs to be the appropriate level, just like maintenance that we talked about for repair, there needs to be the appropriate level of training along with Title X requirements associated with how that would be employed as an operational program of record. So I think those discussions are happening, not just the liability piece, but the actual ownership responsibility piece. And there is a separate training point that can't be understated.
And Craig, you didn't ask this, but maybe Commander Daly or Bruce can answer how their vessels are following coal regs, because that's part of the system that is built into them.
So yeah, that's always the tricky one. It's funny. So we originally went to Pete Small, PMS 406, and say, hey, Pete, what are the coal rigs for this? And he goes, Navy doesn't do that. Go see Coast Guard. So he's like, Coast Guard, what are the coal rigs for this? Well, here's what we have for this stuff. Oh, by the way, can you help us with the unmanned coal rigs for man-unmanned interface? So that's a tricky one, but the best way I can describe it is right now we do the coal rigs to the best of our ability. We follow all the coal rigs, but assume that no matter what happens, if they have the right of way, or even if they don't have the right, we always assume they're going to hit us. So that's the best way to describe it. Stay out, don't hit anything, don't let them hit you. So I
Same as
guess that's
ships,
coal
yeah.
rigs.
Yes, sir.
George, how you doing?
Good.
Steve
Good seeing
Kopeck.
you, Steve.
I'm getting older, George. I'm getting older.
And better looking.
Oh, thank you for that. I appreciate that. So I have a background in unmanned systems and autonomy for about 20 years now. Bruce, I've known you, I think, since you started MARTAC. Jamie, I'm sorry I don't know you. Working your code at NIWC, but unmanned systems autonomy is what I've done. I was on the AUVSI board of directors throughout
Steve, sorry, get a little closer to the mic, please.
I was on the AUVSI board of directors in the early 2000s. Spent a lot of time on that. Parlayed my way onto the CNO Strategic Studies Group. That was the Unmanned Systems Opportunity, became the Unmanned Systems Imperative. Captain, I don't know if I ran across you during that time. But one of the things that brought me up to here today is that's 14 years ago, and we looked at Sea Hunter. And Sea Hunter was going to be the next best thing, and here we are 14 years later. What can we do to accelerate the acceptance and more of the implementation? Funding was the limiter for a long time. Funding now seems to be bringing a lot more opportunity to the integration across all the systems. Trust and acceptance, always a big one, now coming along as well. So I think we're economic and trust driven at this point. So the question is, what can I do so 15 years I'm not standing here, calling into the same groups, working groups that are standing up right now, where they're talking about the same things that we've talked about for 15 years, and I want to throw open my mouth. And I realize they're hardworking people addressing these problems, and they're coming around for the first time and bringing their knowledge. But it seems to me we need to build a little faster, and accelerate what we're trying to do. What are your recommendations to do that? How could we do that? How can we incorporate our Five Eye participants, even more so, our allied and coalition partners, so we can create this, so we don't become the second-tier country in the world?
I want to talk about one of the biggest challenges, of course, for all those systems will be becoming programs of record. And eventually we're going to, obviously, hopefully that will happen, but that's a challenge. And then the whole acceptance of autonomous systems is a challenge. I think one of the things that you all could help with is to help DoD and others demystify the whole issue of autonomy. And among the decision makers, it's very much this idea that autonomy is something different. It's going to take humans. It's something different. Somehow, if we could demystify that and say we're starting small, and that's what we're doing. But I have an article in front of me right now where the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Kath Hicks, a brilliant person, was out talking to a number of companies, Silicon Valley type, and she said, you know, this autonomy stuff is taking longer than I ever imagined. And part of the issue is you need to make clear to the decision makers that this is a challenge, but this is a step-by-step thing, that we have to fund the steps. Eventually, when we get it, we're going to need numbers. Clearly, but there's what I think is if we can kind of politicize the issue, that would be very, very helpful. Getting it into a program of record, that's a challenge because there's all these other things to fund, and if the focus is on readiness, those are new systems. They don't fall under readiness. So that's the other challenge, the either or.
Okay, thank you, Sam. Before I take the next question, I just wanted to, we're getting near the end, I wanted to give Dr. Jamie Lukos an opportunity to talk about, because manned-unmanned teaming and teaming with military and industry has come up so many times, to talk about our naval applications of machine learning workshop at Nightwing PAC.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. And Yeah, autonomy is a hard problem, and I think there has been a lot of progress. Just to kind of follow up on the last question, and you can see, I mean, Bruce and his company, boy, like that didn't exist 15 years ago, right? So I think there has really been a lot of progress. It's just a matter of really taking that progress and accelerating it in these coming years. That's going to be key. Yeah, naval applications of machine learning. So that is a workshop that Nightwing Pacific puts on every year. So if you Google Nightwing and naval applications of machine learning, hopefully it'll come up. It's or there should be stickers at our booth over at the IW Pavilion, and we can get you more information there. But it's in March. I want to say the 14th through the 16th, but don't quote me on that. So it's an in-person meeting. And we have researchers throughout the naval R&D community coming together, talking about the problems, talking about the work that they're doing to try to build solutions to those problems. So it's a really, really cool workshop. And there's also a classified session. So for those with clearances, you can join us on site at Nightwing Pacific and talk about some of those more higher level problems. So thank you, George, for that opportunity to say that.
Jamie. Yes, sir.
Hey, good morning. My name's Joe Mauser from American Defense International. I want to follow up on the question the gentleman asked earlier about mesh networks. Understanding the distinction between major programs of record and buying inexpensive, commercially off-the-shelf, almost commodities. And I'm wondering if you all could talk about what you see as the future, where there's a balance between, program of records and small unmanned assets that are deployed. You know, when you're talking about battle space awareness, okay, that's a piece. And also proliferating nodes out there to be able to maintain resilient communication. Somewhere there's a balance in strategically, how are folks approaching that in terms of how is it procured, how is it going to be managed? Because that, there's probably a medium out there for major program of records, but augmenting that with almost stuff you could buy with a credit card, purely so you can maintain command and control.
Commander Daly, Bruce, I think you two are probably in that swim lane.
Yeah, I'll go first. So in my current hat today at USV Division 1, I represent that major program of record that you speak of. That's the one hat that my interface with NAVC. In the other half, I represent the fleet at the same time, and I operate continuing to do exercises. RIMPAC was last year. We continue to do exercises. And for those of you who heard Admiral Paparo yesterday at lunch, we will continue in the unmanned world to continue to do more and move further west throughout the course of this year. I think by doing that and operating more with the fleet, we'll find those seams and figure out where those soft spots are, right? Again, not in my major program lane, but in the fleet's lane and in the joint environments lane, right? And just one last point. I think the leadership in the current seats at Indo-PACOM with Admiral Aquilino and PAC Fleet with Admiral Paparo, they are in the right spot at the right time to balance trust versus risk and to act quicker because we're in a critical decade. And I think that can't be understated. So.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'd also add, in terms of like the distributed sensing is definitely something that's in our wheelhouse and that we're doing a lot of R&D on. We just haven't gotten to the point of making it operational. So Ocean of Things, for example, is a DARPA program that finished up not too long ago. We were heavily involved with that. So the concept is low cost, consumable sensors. You just throw them out and they're in the water, they do their job. If someone picks them up, it doesn't matter, they don't cost much. They're, just sort of a temporary operational asset. So I see that coming down the line, but I haven't seen it in terms of being picked up by a program of record yet.
And just one really small thing to add to that is from our side of things, things are designed to be completely comms agnostic up front. So even if it's our system, let's say a cheap off-the-shelf type system, ad hoc system, we can put that on there. But the way it's set up, you have a bigger, better system, it'll immediately go on, take precedence, whatever like that. So really to make it handle all things, including all the stuff doing it, the better you make it, that's great.
Right. Okay, thanks.
Thanks. I'm getting the signal. We've got time for one more question. So Becky, you've got it.
Thank you, George. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Becky Vincent. Our company is Vincent Enterprises. We're a San Diego-based woman-owned small business that provides engineering business solutions. And my question is really for each of you, how do you currently work with small businesses? And the reason I ask is I'm curious as to what the potential order of magnitude business opportunity is for us and other small businesses like ours.
So PMS 406 is one organization I work with, right? That's my major program. But our organization is tied with all of the Naval Surface Warfare Center enterprise. So that is our conduit, along with Nightwing Pacific, our conduit into the small business community. And they are, along with the Unmanned Task Force, creating requirements, tying that in with the small businesses through the warfare centers to bring technology to the forefront and engineering solutions.
Yeah, and I would add Nightwing Pacific works a ton with small businesses. It's encouraged. There's a certain amount that's dedicated money-wise to working with small businesses, but there's not like a single formula, right? So it's all about making connections. It's all about really understanding the problems and connecting with the right people. So if you haven't been over to the IW Pavilion yet, that's a great place to start, or we could talk after this too. But it's really like understanding your technology and then connecting you with the right people so that we can see if there's a fit there. So yeah, let's talk after.
Thanks for that question. Please join me in thanking our panel for sharing their views with you today.
U.S. Naval Institute and AFCEA International, we thank our speakers on the panel for taking time to join us today and share their thoughts and insights. We would like to present you with a token of our appreciation, Naval Institute book, Maritime Unmanned by Ernest Snowden and Robert Wood. Before you all head back to the keynote hall, please take a moment to complete the session survey in the West app, and let's give our panel a round of applause. Thank you.